Hi class, welcome to lecture 7. Today we're going to be talking all about interest groups. Now let's go ahead and define what interest groups are. We're going to use the term interest group and the people who work for interest groups throughout the lecture. So it's worth defining as an organization that tries to influence what the government does in order to advance their agenda. So essentially what interest groups do, they're organizations or they're people who work for organizations, we might call them lobbyists, that try to influence the behavior of elected officials, such as members of Congress, presidents, and judges. So any person or any individual in a position to influence policy, that's who interest groups are going after. They represent the interest of the company or group they represent, and they want that interest to be applied by people who can influence policy, again, mostly Congress, but also people in the executive office, as well as sometimes judges. Now, interest groups aren't necessarily a new thing. They've been around for quite a long time, really going back to the formation of our country. And the founding fathers were aware of interest groups, or at least aware of groups petitioning the government. Sometimes they would refer to them as factions, in the same way they'd refer to political parties as factions, essentially separate groups looking out for their own interests. And they had a problem with factions. They worried what they would do to our country. James Madison, in particular, despised factions. He called them selfish and only concerned for their own interests. So as we go through the lecture, see if you agree with James Madison, see if you can form your own opinion on the purpose of interest groups. So we're going to talk about maybe some of the positive aspects of interest groups, but also go into great detail about maybe some of the potential negative aspects of interest groups. So we're going to distinguish between two types of interest group here, public versus private, starting with public interest groups. Public interest groups are simply those that attempt to gain beneficial legislation for the public good and not just their own members. Okay, so maybe some of the criticism that Madison, others, and even contemporary critics have maybe don't apply to public interest groups because they're not looking out for the good of a small group of people. Rather, they're looking out for the good of the entire public. Some examples of this might be groups who form to protect the environment, right? They're not necessarily doing it for themselves. They're doing it because they believe a better environment is good for all humanity. Animal protection groups, right? I would think that everyone would agree that protecting animals isn't beneficial to a select group, but it's probably beneficial to everybody, right? Another group, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, I would say that's very much a public interest group. Their goal is to prevent people from drinking and getting into cars. Right? That is a public good. They're not serving themselves. They're trying to serve the entire American population. So just some examples there. The more common type of interest group is, however, private interest groups. And this is the type of interest group that gets a lot of criticism. It's more common. They have a lot more money. They do a lot more in Washington. And these are the groups that are attempting to gain benefits just for a select group of people that they represent. They're not so much concerned with public good like public interest groups are. They want to advance their own agenda, and that's what they're paid to do. Sometimes there's lobbying firms. I mean, Washington's full of them on K Street, whose only job is companies pay them for their relationships with people in government to enact change that helps their company. Some corporations even have their own lobbying firm in-house, meaning they have people on the payroll whose only job is to try to influence lawmakers' decisions in a way that'll help that company. You'll see that with large-scale corporations, think companies like perhaps Amazon or Apple, companies who have a lot of money to be gained or lost depending on what laws are passed. So private interest groups represent a more select group of people, where public interest groups represent the entire population. So when we're talking about interest groups, when we're talking about influencing government, we might say it's a non-traditional way, in the sense that the traditional way to influence the government might be through voting, right? I mean, that is theoretically why we vote. If we don't like something in the government, or we want to enact change in the government, we elect an official who will hopefully enact that change, right? They campaigns are usually run on promises of what an elected official will do or will not do, and that's why you vote for them. Now, do they always keep that promise? No, of course not. Politicians are famous for breaking campaign promises, but theoretically, that is a way to influence the government. Now, we might think of interest groups as simply an alternative way of influencing the government, right? So let's say you're fed up with politicians, you keep voting for someone who promises to make the change that you want, but they keep failing to do so. You might also say, okay, I'm fed up with this. I'm going to join an interest group and I'm going to pool my money together with a bunch of like-minded individuals. And we're going to lobby the government to enact the change that we want. So in many ways, interest groups are simply another avenue in which individuals, which can belong to interest groups, can enact the change that they want. So we've seen really the number of interest groups explode since the mid-20th century. And in today's world, we have about $3 billion every single year spent on lobbying. That's $3 billion that people are spending, whether they are part of corporations or individuals, to influence the government. That is a ton of money. And you can see, I have this chart here, a little dated, but I think it shows, hopefully, where a lot of this money is going. You see a lot of money going into real estate, finance, insurance, because there's a lot of laws and regulations in those areas that these lobbyists and these companies want to influence. You see a lot going towards energy and natural resources, most of that being oil, right? They want to have laws that are more favorable towards drilling oil that allow them to make more money. You see transportation, defense, construction, labor. These are the groups that tend to spend the most money trying to influence the government. So again, just to make sure we're on the same page here, interest groups lobby, right? That's the action they're doing. Lobbyists are trying to affect the behavior of a government official. That's what interest groups do. So what we'll see often happen, and I'm curious to your guys' opinion on this, after many congressmen and women retire, or perhaps they lose an election, many of them will go from political office to a lobbying firm, to an interest group perhaps. And the reason being is because these lobbying firms pay a ton of money, right? They value the relationships and the contacts that former congressmen and women have. So they're willing to pay top dollar to allow these former politicians to come work for their firm. Now, you have to wait a year in between public office and joining a lobbyist firm. But a lot of these politicians perhaps see lobbying as kind of their retirement plan. I mean, how much are you making in Congress? You know, maybe 150 to 300,000, depending on which house you're in, depending on how long you've been in Congress, et cetera. Good money. I mean, nothing to sneeze at. I'd love to make that. I'm sure we all would. That's fantastic money, but it's not rich, right? It's not, you know, for lack of a better term, it's not FU money, right? So the lobbyists, they do make FU money. They make a ton of money. We're talking millions of dollars a year sometimes. So they'll often jump ship, go to the other side, and rake in money because, again, these lobbying firms, these firms that lobby the government, value those relationships they have. Because if you're a former congressperson, other congresspeople who are still in office are going to answer your calls, and that's what they want. They just want to get in the door and try to influence these people. So it is a somewhat controversial thing that we get a lot of politicians becoming lobbyists, but it is how the system currently works. So we're going to talk about a couple different strategies that interest groups use to lobby. And those two strategies are inside games and outside games. So let's start with inside game. Inside game is just the traditional classic lobbying you probably think of or you see in movies and TV show. It's directly contacting a public official, meeting them behind closed doors and attempting to influence them, okay? So let's say, let's just keep using Amazon because I have a couple of packages from Amazon on my doorstep right now, actually. Let's say I'm an in-house lobbyist for Amazon, okay? And I wanna make sure they're passing laws that make it easier to keep wages down or easier to buy land for facilities, whatever it might be that benefits my company, okay? How I'm gonna do that is I'm going to use relationships to meet with politicians that can influence policy. I'm going to go to their office or go to a dinner, whatever it might be, and talk to them and say, this is our position, this is our strategy. We'd love to support you. Okay. And in doing so, hopefully they will be more friendly to the interest of Amazon, my company. Outside game is a little different, or a lot different really. And it's more of a strategy that's used when money is an issue, when you can't just burn money like Amazon or Apple does. Outside game lobbying is more grassroots. Maybe you've heard the term before, grassroots lobbying. They call it grassroots because it starts from the ground up. Just like grass, it grows. It starts with the people. It grows from there, from the bottom. It's attempting to mobilize support at a local level, getting people on your side and pushing through policy, putting pressure on politicians to enact changes that you want to see. So the goal here, the ultimate goal, is to help gain public support. You want the public on your side. And if you have enough people on your side, you can put pressure on elected officials to do what you want. Because after all, at the end of the day, they're not going to get reelected unless people are happy with them. So what I will say about outside game lobbying is it's somewhat very difficult. And you can see in the strategies they use, marches, rallies, media, whenever they can get on, shock value tactics sometimes, petitions, letter writing, mass emails. And because of a lack of funds, perhaps it can be very difficult. And the idea of, I went too far there. The idea of getting the public on your side is more difficult than it seems, right? The level of sympathy from the public versus annoyance is sometimes a thin line to walk, right? If you're staging a protest and it's peaceful, sometimes you can garner sympathy, right? Especially if there's an overreaction from law enforcement. We've seen that over and over again. I mean, if we think about it, that was Martin Luther King's ultimate strategy, right? Peaceful protest, which is why he was such an amazing man. I mean, to be peaceful in the face of such overwhelming systematic abuse is truly amazing what he did. But he gained public sympathy, was able to successfully change some policy versus some organizations that haven't been as successful, maybe using violence or blocking traffic. This tends to not garner public sympathy, but that line is sometimes fickle and it's very hard to do and very hard to walk, which is again why Dr. King was such an amazing man. So why is lobbying allowed? What's the legality behind it? Well, most people don't know this, but it's actually included in the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? There's really 5 aspects of the First Amendment, all of which you should really know because it's such an important amendment. Let's go ahead and read that now. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that last line of the First Amendment of the Constitution really gives legality to interest groups and lobbying firms because you have the constitutional right to petition the government for grievances. Essentially, what that's saying is you have the right to complain to the government if you see a problem. Now, when that amendment was included in the Constitution, did they know that corporations would be spending billions of dollars to influence the government? Probably not. I mean, they are aware that maybe people would use it and maybe it wouldn't necessarily be a positive thing at all times, like we talked about Madison before. But essentially why they included that was they wanted people to be able to complain if they thought something was unjust without legal action, right? They wanted a free and open society in which you can criticize your government. So because of that, the legality of interest groups is very hard to dispute. So there are regulations on lobbying. You should be aware of that. It's not a free-for-all. For one, lobbyists cannot ask for a direct payback from a government official. So what does that mean? You can't say, here's $1 million, pass this law. What's that called? Bribery, okay? You cannot do that. Also, you have to be actively registered with the government if you're a lobbyist. They have to have a record of you to know what you're lobbying, okay? So they want to keep track of you, make sure you're not committing acts of bribery. What's more, if you're a lobbyist, you have to report how much you're spending and what policies you're trying to influence. every 6 months. So the government does try to keep a short leash on this, again, to discourage bribery and corruption. So there are strict monetary limits on lobbyists, and I don't care that you know the exact amounts, $2,700 or $49.99. I don't care you know those amounts. I do want you to know, though, the government does limit the amount of money that lobbyists can give a politician. And if you're curious, those limits are $2,700 per election from individuals. Again, that's following the same PAC and super PAC guidelines. If you're a lobbyist, you can give gifts, but only up to, let's just say $50 at a time and $100 in a year, and a total of $100 for a year in sporting tickets and meals, et cetera. So you can't just take a congressperson out to, Morton Steakhouse and spend $3,000. Okay, there is limits to all. They've really tried to close the loopholes in that regard. But that being said, there are more loopholes, which we're talking about in a second. Other government regulations, as I said before, if you leave public office, you have to wait a year before joining a lobbying firm. And also you can't, if you're a lobbyist, you can't buy trips for Congress people. Okay, you can't send them to Hawaii for a week as a gift, because again, that kind of counts as bribery. Not kind of, it does count as bribery. Okay, I mentioned loopholes. Let's talk about some of those loopholes. So we always hear about this corruption and people giving money to influence politicians. How do they get around those strict monetary limits that we talked about? A few ways. The biggest way is they can help raise money for campaigns through PACs and super PACs. So if you remember from our previous lectures, PACs can donate money directly to candidates, but there's a limit on the amount of money they can spend. Super PACs cannot donate money directly to candidates, but they have no limit to how much they can spend. So generally, how lobbyists get around these strict monetary gift limits is through PACs and super PACs. So they might say, we really want you to support this bill, support this law, vote in friendly legislation that helps our company, and we'd love to support your campaign re-election coming up in the next year. Okay, so is that bribery? Or is that a donation? The line, guys, is super thin. Let me give you an example here, because I really want this point to stick. If I let's use the example, I work for Amazon. I want them to pass a certain law that helps my business, which is Amazon. If I walk in there and I throw $1 million on the desk and I say, pass this law, that's bribery. I'm going to jail if it gets out. But if same situation, I go into the office of a congressperson and I say, hey, we have this law, we really want it to pass, it would really help out our business. We support what you do. We'd love to support your re-election campaign next year. Do you think that this is something you'd like to do? Is that bribery? I mean, the end result is the same, but the language is different. The second example isn't bribery because I didn't exchange something for something else. I said I'd love to support you. That doesn't mean I pledged any money. Okay, so that line between donation lobbying and bribery is really paper thin. So, some critics might say there really is no difference. So we know that money tends to have a big influence in politics, which leads to this kind of funny comic that I thought, not comic, but meme or whatever it is, I thought you guys might enjoy. Congress should wear jackets like NASCAR drivers so we can know who bought them. Can you imagine if every company or individual that a congressperson took money for, they had to sew a little patch on their suit? It would end one of two ways. One, people would stop taking money because they'd be embarrassed. Or two, they'd be shameless and they'd show up to Congress looking like this. What do you guys think is more realistic? I don't know. I think they'd probably just show up like this. You can see they have like Mobile, Goodyear, GoDaddy on there. Something to think about, though. So that's going to wrap up part A of this lecture. Thanks for tuning in. I'll have part B up momentarily.